author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The right to speak one's mind and freely express one's ideas is the very thing that makes us human. And yet these facets appear to be under attack, not only at home, but also from abroad. That's what we're going to be discussing on today's special First Amendment show, right here on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Free speech issues are front and center in the public consciousness, and that's not just in the United States, that's worldwide. Now, we're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza, who happens to be a constitutional lawyer. So he's very much the appropriate person to be discussing the recent developments with. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Thank you, Mark. And I am a graduate of a U.S. law school and have concentrated mostly in our U.S. legal system. And it seems like what we're learning is to take the threat seriously from across the pond, which is to say that we get our legal traditions, even though we broke away from the United Kingdom and fought a war against the king way back when.
You didn't need tea. Nobody needs
many
tea.
Many of our traditions and rules and regulations come from our legacy of the Commonwealth law tradition that Britain kind of gave to the world, if you will. And the war against free speech and expression has reached a fever pitch in the UK, with now annually thousands and thousands of people being arrested simply for what they post on social media, culminating, I think this was a week and a half ago, with the creepiest post imaginable by the UK government, which said, think before you post. And what was left unsaid is, or we'll come to your house and break down your door and drag you out of it and throw you in a cage.
Which is what's happened. It's a couple of interesting points that you raised there, Scott, before we dive into the specific issues. Is one that, firstly, that, I believe it's over 3,000, pushing 4,000 people are annually arrested for social media posts in the United Kingdom, which
that's not the Soviet Union, or that's not North Korea. That's in the United Kingdom.
I believe Konstantin Krisin of the Trigonometry podcast pointed out that in the Soviet Union it's about 400 people a year. So we've got quite the increase there. So that's pretty interesting. Another fascinating thing that you point out there is that the United States obviously took a lot of its legal heritage from Britain. And so one would imagine that Britain would be quite proud of exporting this, let's say what it is, it's this aura of law and order and fair play, which we've obviously, as a Brit, we kind of pride ourselves on the fair play aspect. But what's happening now is that this more Napoleonic system heralded back in by the European Union, it is creeping into British law. And that's a concerning thing in itself, because what it essentially says is that the traditions that the United States, the founding fathers, so embraced when designing this wonderful obviously they didn't design 50, but designing this petri dish of democracy, that's all gone, or that's on its way out. It's not going to exist for much longer.
Especially, Mark, and I just want to cut in to say, when U.S. leaders, bringing it back home, make noises about speech not being protected and seemingly intentionally obfuscate and muddy the waters for what is free speech and what is not. For instance, the recently chosen vice presidential pick from Kamala Harris, Mr. Waltz, has said, called speech hate speech and included it in speech that's illegal. And of course, I'll just say it now because it needs to be said early and often, because of what's the popular misconception is there is no legal classification as hate speech, and speech that is not threatening or likely to incite immediate violence is not illegal and cannot be criminalized under our current system and the way that the United States Supreme Court has currently ruled our First Amendment protects. Now, I say all of those things as current because there are, of course, moves to change those things. But for now and ever since the founding, no such thing as hate speech legally, and all that speech is protected under the First Amendment.
It does seem to me that this idea of hate speech, this notion that people have, I don't know where they get this from, but it's this idea that they have a right not to be offended by things. And
Not
that,
only that, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
no, that's right. It just strikes me as, and I don't want to say mentally weak because that's perhaps a little too far on what it is, but it's mentally fragile, perhaps, or intellectually fragile is probably the best way to put it. Because if you're never challenged on anything, then you're never going to develop as a person. I mean, our very strength as human beings comes from the challenges that we overcome, and we become better for it. And if you're never challenged on anything, whether that's physical or intellectual, you're never going to develop to be the full-bodied, thinking, emoting being that we all should be striving to be.
I'll
Or is
say
that
it
too esoteric?
I'll say it in a way that progressives can appreciate. No mud, no lotus. You got to have the struggle there. Absolutely. Yeah. And the other thing too, that I think bears noting, Mark, is just because you could doesn't mean you should. Meaning, let's say if the First Amendment didn't exist, what is the impetus to criminalize speech that you disagree with anyway? That, like, as you say, the notion is that they can't handle it because their idea set is so weak that it can't handle a challenge. And it is the mark of, I think, a poorly conceived idea, and weakly defended if it can't withstand, robust criticism on Twitter or social media or just in public.
Yes, I mean that's one of the key aspects, isn't it? Because it's not exactly a long journey from speech of certain kinds being criminalized on a social media platform to speech in real life being
I don't want to
criminalized in
get
your public life.
hyperbolic, but this is maybe going to sound a bit hyperbolic to people.
Well,
It's not a
you
hard.
put the hyperbolic disclaimer there, so
It's
you're allowed to be as
it's not a
hyperbolic as you
long
like.
line, but I mean, it really, to me, it is a very short line there. If you can tell somebody, you think about what's involved in putting somebody into custody, meaning snatching them from their home. They may lose custody of children. They may have pets die. They may lose their employment, lose their home, and throw them in a cage. And what happens in those cages, which may be very necessary to keep a horribly violent, awful person out of society. But to keep somebody out of society who's tweeted in a manner that some person has found offensive, to do that to a person, that's the, and that we all vote that it's okay to put a human being in a cage because of a tweet, because that's what's happening in the UK, and many want it to happen in the United States.
Let's delve a bit deeper on this, Scott. So we have there's this nexus of law enforcement and politics in the UK, and so when we talk about how if one person is offended, it's not that there's one person offended. What it is the apparatus of the state is taking offense on people's behalf.
Right.
And so what we've had is some very unclear, and this is the worst thing. You're a lawyer, Scott, and I don't hold that against you, but there's the lack of clarity on what the government and the police officers or the police hierarchy are telling the British people, that think before you post. Well, they're not saying these are the very specific things that you
Right.
cannot post, right? Because they will run afoul of this section of the law and you'll be prosecuted under these different statutes. They're not saying that. What they're saying is think before you post. And what they're really saying is be fearful before you post. And the idea is, as far as I can tell, is to stop people expressing their genuine beliefs because they don't know if it's going to land them, as you say, in a cage, possibly losing their families, their homes, their livelihood, certainly if you're in a cage for 20 months or 30 months. And there's no clarity. And I think that lack of clarity comes from the idea that essentially they want people to be afraid of expressing or using their voice. What's your take on that?
That's exactly right, and it is the mark of tyranny for that to be the case, where you don't know if you're in compliance with the law or not. In the United States, for instance, laws can be unconstitutionally vague because our American system requires that they be clear to follow. Now, that may be a laugh line for some if you read deep into the federal law books, but that's how things are supposed to be. An American is not supposed to have to consult an attorney to understand how they may comport themselves in compliance with the law. It's supposed to be pretty simple to not be a criminal and to know what is a crime and what isn't a crime. And that's a bulwark of liberty, is to be able to say, okay, I'm coloring within the lines here. I'm allowed to do X, Y, or Z, or not. And then those things can be challenged if they're prohibited or forbidden. But how do you challenge a watch out or watch your back kind of statement? It is ominous and scary, and absent some massive counter movement by the people and authorities who made that statement, I think we're right to assume that that's the purpose of that statement, was to instill fear and, I mean, for lack of a better term, mark terror in the population for people who wish to exercise their free speech rights to say something, again, which is unpopular. We don't need protections in the UK, in the United States, or even North Korea for popular sentiments. You can say, dear leader and chairman is the best person who's ever lived on the face of the planet in North Korea.
We call him Prime Minister Keir Starmer over here.
Don't need free speech for that. We need free speech for hate speech, for saying the worst things about those in power. That's the only thing that we need protection from, is those in power who have the capacity to stymie free speech. And protecting it against those speakers is fundamental.
We'll be continuing this conversation after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm Mark Angelides. We're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Earlier in the show, we've been talking about the necessity of protecting free speech and how recent events in the UK, in many ways, tangentially, are impacting the United States. And I think it's time to talk about a certain immigrant to the United States, arguably the most successful African-American immigrant to the United States, Mr. Elon Musk. You see what I did there?
I didn't see that one coming.
There you go.
I appreciate that.
Now,
Indeed.
he's engaged in some kind of digital slanging match with the UK government because of various tweets that he's made, X posts that he's made on his X platform, discussing the situation in Britain. And specifically, I'm talking about the riots and the unrest that have so marked the last couple of weeks. Now, we have a movement among sitting government in power, to limit what people are able to say and also what people are able to see on their social media. And this was exemplified just before arguably the biggest social media event of the year, the Trump-Musk interview. I don't know if anybody watched that, but it's pretty fascinating. And just before that, a commissioner of the European Union, please bear in mind that Britain is no longer part of the European Union, yet for some reason there are still various statutes that apply. But he put out an open letter to Mr. Musk saying that he has responsibilities to ensure that incitement and hate doesn't appear on his platform. And that was timed to go out right before his interview, or his conversation is a better word, his conversation with former President Donald Trump. And it seems to me that there's veiled threats there, as in, nice social media company you've got there. If you don't follow what we tell you, you're out of Europe.
Well, it seems like a veiled or maybe not too veiled threat. Anytime the government body, regulators or legislators or presidents or prime ministers speak like that, that has to be what's implied, is not that they're commanding the body politic or asking people in civil society to respond, but that they're speaking with the hammer, of their government power behind it. And of course, when Musk bought Twitter, he said he was doing so to secure the electronic public square for Americans and I suppose the world. And so he's going to, I expect, push back against that and continue doing so. And to the extent that he does it, he's a hero for free speech. I've certainly been critical of him. Matter of fact, I saw some reporting earlier about Donald Trump's criticisms of Musk with his reliance on taxpayer-funded subsidies to advance his Tesla company. And I was and have been and still will be a vocal critic of that all day long. But I think right now we have to count him as a free speech hero, because we know that when Jack criticized Jack Dorsey, and I forget the woman's name that he appointed to run Twitter when he was off surfing or doing whatever he was doing, who was a cheerleader for these trust and safety councils that inevitably, somehow or another, always muzzled and throttled the speech of conservatives and libertarians and people who were anti-state and pro-individual rights, and openly, kind of turned up the volume and reach on posts by pro-establishment, anti-speech advocates. So Elon is in for the big win on this, and I hope that he succeeds not just here in the United States with his pro-free speech stance, but also in the UK.
So there's an interesting aspect to take out of this, that there have been threats and insinuations that American citizens posting about events in the UK could face extradition. Now, before you give me your legal analysis on that, I figured that's ridiculous bluster on behalf of the people who are making these statements.
Yeah.
However, I'm not so sure that if the current trajectory of the lack of respect for free speech, free expression, and indeed the First Amendment continues on this sort of downwards track that's happening in the United States. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. But there could come a time when that does happen, when people who post about international affairs, that country that is, let's call it a digital pearl clutching at the very heights of government, and they decide to try and teach the world a lesson, it's ridiculous, isn't it? It can't happen, or can it?
Well, let's take the first thing first. And you're right to say that this is not the law currently. And that's why you can, for instance, blaspheme against Islam in the United States and not suffer extradition and the death penalty in Saudi Arabia or another country that punishes those sorts of statements. Because in the United States, our free speech protections include a superseding protection against any kind of international attempt to criminalize our behavior, for instance. So for now, anyway, Americans don't have to worry about that, although they do have to worry about it for the future. And you're right to point it out. And that's the reason why I think that what's happening in the UK is so important to Americans. It's not just some rando republic somewhere that has no bearing on our future. Not that it's foretelling our future, but it's always important for us to protect free speech by being ever vigilant. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
We'll be back after this short break on a whole new topic. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're continuing our conversation about free speech, the First Amendment, freedom of expression, and how this relates both in the United States and internationally with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Now, we've been covering the whole gamut really here, Scott, haven't we? We've talked hate speech, what it is, what it isn't. We've talked about
all your countrymen giving the world a bunch of trouble, Mark.
Well, that's what we're most well known for. Just ask a quarter of the known world back in the 19th century. But I'd like to continue what we were just discussing in the earlier part, Scott. And really the idea that laws in other countries can impact constitutional elements within the United States. And you pointed out that really the system is kind of protected against that, which is why you can commit blasphemy against Islam, for example, on a social media company that appears in Saudi Arabia, for example. But you obviously can't be prosecuted for such things there. But is that going to be a continuation as we go on, or do we see changes in structure to, for example, the Supreme Court that could impact how the free speech protections, First Amendment protections are, what's the right word, interpreted?
Interpreted, eviscerated, choose your adjective. Yeah, these are all possible.
Or verb, for that matter.
This is why we, as I said, I'll say it again. You could say it as many times. It's always good to say it. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, Mark. And without guarding against those who would, they don't, the murderers of free speech don't come to say, we're going to kill free speech. They say, we need to protect X, Y, or Z, or this is a vulnerable population, or this particular speaker is an ogre and a horrible person, and therefore they have to be silenced. It doesn't come with a full frontal assault on, the idea of free speech is bad and we shouldn't have it. In fact, they say it like they're protectors of free speech, like somehow this is, so they don't have an honest attack. It's not like persons who, another contentious issue might be abortion rights. Abortion opponents often just say, we want to ban abortion writ large, all in. And then they can be attacked for that stance. But that's not how the anti-speech campaigners or activists work. They try to slide in and attack it from an oblique angle so that your defenses aren't up against it. And I think that's how these things slide in. I remember when they first put up the federal hate crime laws, and it was with sympathy towards racial and sexual orientation minorities who were assaulted. So some guy gets the life beat out of him because it's a racist attack, and the idea is that somehow there need to be extra charges on because of the nature of the attack. Now, what happens is those of us who stand up against that and say we shouldn't be able to punish people for the ideas, along with the compliant media, are shouted down by saying like somehow that's racist or something like that, or you're pro minorities being attacked, instead of just saying the ideas that people hold in one's head, whether they keep them to themselves or they espouse them, should never be punished criminally. But the trend has been moving away from that in the United States to the extent that it can. Now, there is that Supreme Court precedent limit where, okay, they're going to bump up against that. But could it change? Well, when the Supreme Court's packed with, the goal and vision of the Biden administration and the Schumer packing scheme would be to add enough Supreme Court justices so that basically any justice who had been appointed by a Republican would be outvoted or outnumbered. And, that threat is existing continuously as long as they may think they can succeed. Now, I think it's fortunate that they haven't succeeded, because I think it would be very detrimental to the country to significantly alter the composition of the court to achieve, those political gains. But the threat's there.
Indeed it is. There's something quite fascinating that I've been hearing, and I've heard it around for a couple of years, and I've heard it in both America and the United Kingdom. And it's to talk about how, because obviously in the United Kingdom we don't have a First Amendment protection, although apparently there are protections for free speech, which are ever-moving goalposts in many ways, as has been demonstrated in recent weeks. But there's this idea, and I've seen it on both sides of the Atlantic, that misinformation is not protected under free speech laws or under the First Amendment. And I'd like your thoughts on that, Scott, with and a follow-up question after you've given me your...
Well, in the United States, hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, lying, you name it, is protected speech. It's okay to lie. Now, defaming someone or committing fraud against them or inducing them to commit fraud or any number of other things may be prohibited. But just lying, just saying it's raining out when it's sunny, or anything you want to say about a political, candidate, they're not arresting immigrants who commit crimes against the native born, for instance, which I think has been alleged in the UK as one of the quote unquote mistruths that's been reported. That's perfectly acceptable in the United States as a non-criminal act. There may be civil liabilities, especially for defamation, but not criminal.
Okay, so the reason I asked that question is because there has been, as you point out, there's been a lady arrested. I actually used to see her ex posts on this, but she was arrested for falsely naming the person who committed the stabbings that were the impetus, not necessarily the cause, but the impetus for the recent riots in the UK. And
so let me just stop you right there with a US-based law analysis of what you just said, if I could, okay?
Sure.
So if that was done intentionally, then you could say that there may be some criminal implication. But basically in the United States, the person who was falsely named, they would have a civil cause of action for defamation against the person who made that tweet. So they would have to sue that person, and they could then recover in a civil law context, but that person would not generally suffer any kind of criminal investigation or charge or sanction because what they said wasn't true.
The reason I take us down this particular rabbit hole is because the idea of misinformation implies that there's correct information, right? So there's two parts. There's correct information, and
there's the information the Crown wants you to have, or
right.
And the Council on Foreign Relations says is okay.
The Trilateral Commission, etc.,
yeah, name it.
So there's with that splitting of the two, there's information and there's misinformation. It brings to the fore the question of who is the arbiter of what is information and what is misinformation.
It's the people who have the guns, Mark. That's who's the arbiter.
Well, that's probably the most correct answer. But I'd like to dig a little bit deeper on that in terms of how such things are justified. So, for example, if somebody had been away on the Mir space station for a couple of years without any information, they came back to Earth.
Imagine the world.
2017, for example, maybe 2018, and they would look around and have the absolute firm belief that Donald Trump was a Russian asset,
yes,
and that he cooperated with the Russians to cheat Hillary
Putin's
Clinton.
Greatest victory to place Trump atop the American power structure.
Absolutely.
His toady.
So that was the information, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so at that point, when you have arbiters of what is information, what is misinformation, it's very clear that the power structures that are in place. I mean, Hillary Clinton, who was the top of the ticket, she was essentially the de facto leader of the Democratic Party at that point.
The author of the Russia collusion.
Yes.
Her team, anyway, the author of the Russia collusion hoax.
Yes. And then, of course, you have the compliant media that was also pushing everything based on the Steele dossier, which was completely debunked. And so what you end up with is you have people who are clearly able to be wrong, deciding what is your truth.
And let's add one more component to that, Mark, which is that in a pre-Elon Musk Twitter, the dominant social media companies acting in lockstep with those government bodies to punish those who would speak truth to power and say something that wasn't, approved.
So in the United States, currently, there is no arbiter of truth. Do we expect that to stay the same?
As long as people believe and fight for freedom, we have a chance. And Van Morrison said, "You can't stop us on the road to freedom. You can't stop us because our eyes can see." And I hope that that's still true. And
men of granite, men of insight. Scott Cosenza, a man of granite, a man of insight himself. Thanks ever so much for joining us. We'll be back after this short break on a whole new topic. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Now, we've been joined by Liberty Nation's Legal Affairs Editor, Scott Cosenza, for the show. And we've been talking free speech, First Amendment at home and abroad. But now, Scott, I'd like to discuss something of equal importance, and that's the Joe Biden administration push to, and I'm going to, for those of you just listening on the radio here, I'm going to use the air quotes thing, reform the Supreme Court. What's the latest there?
The scare, SCAIR
quotes.
Quotes. Yeah, indeed. It's, I'm not a political analyst for the site, but I do kind of pay attention to political matters. It does seem a bit weird that as he's going out the door on a lack of
support,
mental acuity, and kind of dexterity wave, I think is fair to say, right? That's why Joe Biden is not, at least publicly stated, that's why he's not the nominee. That there's a massive push for this thing that, America has not been clamoring for, which is a constitutional amendment changing how the United States Supreme Court works. And what we don't have is, of course, I shouldn't say of course, what we don't have is the actual amendment proposed. It would be like me saying, Mark, we should have an amendment that, and just insert whatever you and I might think is a laudatory goal, but then not discuss what the actual terms of the amendment are. And what's kind of preposterous about that for anybody who spends a lot of time looking at these issues like I do is this simple, a one-word insertion or deletion in an amendment can change everything about it. The Supreme Court's wrestling with, or politicians wrestling with what a well-regulated militia means, for instance, in the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, it seems obvious to me that the founders meant that people shouldn't have their rights to firearms abridged by legislation or the government. And that seems very clear. But somehow for massive numbers of people who were law professors, governors, and presidents of the United States, it meant some kind of state militia thing. So the idea that you can just put out a laudatory goal, even though I don't think it is laudatory, there are three provisions of the amendment that Biden has asked for, which is one that gives term limits for Supreme Court justices, the idea being that every person who serves as a four-year president would get, I think, 2 appointments. And the second one is that there be no, it's so funny too, because they're not in the same bucket. In other words, there are 2 provisions that deal with the Supreme Court itself, term limits and also the imposition of the second is so there's the introduction of this code of conduct. So with term limits and code of conduct, those are how the Supreme Court, itself is constructed. And then the third thing is no immunity for former presidents. Now, I don't know if that's supposed to be backdated so that they can then throw Donald Trump in prison for something they haven't been able to throw him in prison for, or frustrate some future attempt at running for office. But in any case, those are the 3 things. And you start tinkering around with the court, and who knows what you're going to get. I think that the impetus is, though, what you're not going to get is what you have now, which is a conservative majority issuing forth decisions that conservatives are generally pleased with, and that frustrate those who have had for generations the court kind of rubber stamping their idea about how the Constitution should go, namely majority lefty courts that were not assertive of the right to keep and bear arms, for instance, or restrictive of abortions, which we currently see the court's composition leaning towards.
So there's a few things to unpack there, Scott. The first one is, if this really meant something to President Joe Biden, why didn't he do it when he first got into office? Why didn't he, in fact, campaign on it? And why didn't he do it when he had actual power before he became quite honestly, the lamest of lame duck presidents that is
Mark, he was busy
possibly ever
saving the
been.
economy, right? What is he?
Yeah, 20% cumulative inflation. How's that going, Mr. President? So, I mean, obviously that's a blasé answer, and
Yeah, but what
not
would it have
intended
been?
seriously.
That's what you haven't looked at.
What would it have been?
No, I'm kidding. Of
It
course.
was what 1.4, I believe, was what it was.
Yeah.
Not the
The
9%.
thing about not campaigning on it, I think, is fascinating. Like the idea, and if we look at the compliant press, the big box media, the way they've treated the story, I think is fascinating in the sense of if the United States of America once wishes to change the composition of the Supreme Court, wouldn't that be, to use their language, worthy of a conversation over the course of maybe multiple election cycles and including vigorous debates on all the different provisions that might be established to change the court, and then look at what their downstream consequences might be, and then of course debating the specific language involved to be able to articulate those things and try to weigh in on them. But with this, it's none of it. It's just, here are some ideas that I think are laudable, so let's support an amendment that's unwritten to somehow institute them. It's kind of preposterous, honestly. Except that it's scary as hell because it could happen. In other words, who knows what could actually occur.
Here's the sniff test, as it were. It's an interesting hypothetical that should be applied to the similar principles should be applied to pretty much every far-reaching decision that you suspect of being started through a bias, a political bias, and that is, here you go. I'll run this by you, and you put on your progressive hat if you've got one. So let's say that this all happens and Joe Biden gets his wish, and each president can appoint two, or each president per term, presumably, can appoint two new Supreme Court justices. Now, let's say that, just for example, Donald Trump wins in this November, and he gets to appoint two more, and he appoints conservative justices that are far to the right of anybody, even Clarence Thomas, right? And then in 2028, Ron DeSantis comes in, or J.D. Vance comes in, wins 2 terms. So that's another 6 justices, all to the right of Clarence Thomas. And then somebody else comes in, Vivek Ramaswamy comes in, and he wins in...
This just sounds like a fever dream.
And he wins, and he appoints 2 more and 2 more.
Uh-huh.
At that point, do they still say this is a good idea? Do the people who are proposing it now say it's a good idea?
It doesn't pass the laugh test. All you have to do is see when these proposals came out. It's in response to decisions that were off-putting to the people who are making the case for the change. So
yeah, if the answer is no, it's a purely selfish, self-serving.
Yes, they don't like the result. They want to get a different result. This is the way to get the quickest way to get a different result. And also, maybe they don't get their new justices, but maybe some justices change their votes. We know that Chief Justice Roberts, is susceptible to media portrayals of his helming of the court, and famously switched his vote in the Obamacare decision, had ruled it unconstitutional in the face of a withering criticism that he might do just that. He switched his vote to say that it was legal to require Americans to buy health care insurance or have to pay up if they didn't.
Never make wild wishes, because you never know if they're going to come true. Scott Cosenza, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to thank our guest for today, Scott Cosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, and of course extend my gratitude to you at home for taking the time to tune in and either listen to us live on the Radio America Network or see us on catch-up on the pages of libertynation.com, on your Roku channel, on Amazon Fire, YouTube, Rumble, X, we're on them all. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.